Hello, I'm Tiffany, creator of Red Petal Patterns, and this is Knitting Basics for Beginners. And this episode is going to be about knots and joining your yarn. So when you buy yarn, sometimes you will come across these little knots. They will be tiny. You'll feel it. You may not even see it, but you'll feel it. And this is where, when they were spooling the yarn at the factory, or even if it was handmade, but it's rare that you're going to get this in hand-spun yarn, they ran out of the one long thread of yarn, and somebody at the factory tied on a new one and then kept winding. You should rarely find knots in your yarn. If you find a lot of knots in your yarn, don't buy that yarn again. That is not good quality. A person knew that they had done that, and that is just poor quality to have multiple knots in one ball or skein of yarn. You do not trust that knot. That is not to be knitted in. You need to get rid of that knot. You need to take a pair of scissors. Before that knot happens, you need to work a good, I like to use about 6 inches of a tail, but when I come to the end of yarn, you want to cut that section and then join your yarn. And that is what I'm going to talk about today. There are several ways to join yarn. I'm going to show you the 2 most simple ways, and then I'm not going to show you the way. There is a thing called a German joining, and it depends on felting. Felting is when animal fibers will knot themselves together. If you've ever had a pet, you would know that their fur can tangle up into these little knots that you cannot get out. And what that is on the individual strands of fur, there are barbs that go in one direction. So you can pull on the hair in one direction and it's smooth, and on the other direction it's rough. You can do it with your own hair. You can feel going one direction is smooth and one direction is rough. And those are the keratin layers on the outside of hair. And it works kind of like scales on a fish or shingles on a roof. They all line up in one direction. On animal fibers, because it's not the same as hair, the cuticle layer, but it's made of keratin. On animals, that hair is even rougher, and the barbs are even bigger. When they get next to each other, they like to work themselves into each other with those barbs, and they can't pull out because it's rough going that direction. And if you get 2 of them next to each other that have worked themselves into each other, you won't be able to pull them out. And if you get a bunch of them together, and they will keep digging in and in and in and in and in until they have made a knot that cannot be penetrated. And that is felting. Now, if you have bought felt at a craft store, that was probably acrylic felt, and that was an artificial process. That's not the same thing as wool felt. When you buy a wool coat that feels very dense and thick, that has been felted. You can also buy wool yarn, and it will felt, which is one of the reasons you don't want to wash wool yarn, because it will felt. Unless you buy, it's called superwash. It goes through a lot of chemical processes. It takes the barbs off and keeps it from doing that tangle thing. When you do German joining, you depend on that felting action. So you would take your two ends of yarn and you can unwrap it just a little, lay them on top of each other, get it a little moist, and agitate it so that they work into each other. And then it won't come loose, and you won't see any difference in the yarn. It'll be a smooth join. This only works with animal fibers that have not gone through the superwash process. It will not work on any other yarn. Now that I have given my public service announcement, we're going to talk about all the other yarns out there that you might need to join. Not only will you find knots in your yarn that you will need to cut out and start over, you may want to change colors. You may actually make it to the end of a ball of yarn because you're actually making a large project now. And you need to know how to get from the end of this one to the beginning of the new one. There are a few ways to do this. One is to just work to the end of the row. You don't have enough to get back to the other side, so you go ahead and leave it. You are changing colors on that row, or you are starting a new ball of yarn and you've run out of this one. In that case, you would just turn it around, pick up the new yarn, and start knitting. You want to leave a little bit of a tail, and then just start knitting like it was regular. You're going to have a little bit of a space there where it's going to try to come loose because it's not connected to anything. You can tie a single time in there if you want to, put stitch markers in there, anything to hold it together. These can later be woven in or hidden in the seams. Or if you're using little pieces, you can actually feed that through and use that to stitch the pieces together. Another way is if you are in the middle of a row, you're working in the round, you're changing colors, you can do what is called a clasping join. And this is where you will use both strands of yarn. And I'm sorry I don't have two different colors to show you, but I'm going to try to make this clear. You have your working piece, your yarn that you're using now. You have your new yarn. You will loop this yarn this way and this yarn this way so that the two are looped together. And then you will use both of these, and you want, depending on how many stitches per inch you're getting on there, you want at least 4 stitches caught in this loop of yarn. I would prefer to have too long of a tail over having too short of a tail. I personally like to work 6 stitches, but everyone else seems to be lucky only using 4 stitches. So now you have your loop here, and there it is in the center, but when you pull it, it kind of disappears. So you're working with 2 yarns. Now, depending on which hand holds the yarn, the other hand is going to hold that loose end down so that you don't pull it out while you're working. And you're just going to go in and work these together like you normally would, as if it was just a single yarn, and work all of your stitches normal. So I'm just going to keep working my rib. That's 3 stitches, 4 stitches, 5 stitches, 6 stitches, and there's my join right there, if you can see it. There's my join. So you're just going to keep sliding down to the new yarn. And there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And as I said, I like to have 6 stitches. That's what I trust. 6 stitches on each side of that join. Now, that's the tail from the new yarn. I'm just going to throw that out of the way. Later on, that can be woven in, or it can be snipped off at this point. You don't need it. Going to continue making my stitches, and when you come around to the other side, you need to remember that you have 2 pieces of yarn and not 1. So let me come around and show you what that looks like. That's another reason why you need to know how many there were, so you know when you're done and you can stop looking. So there's my stitch, but you see now there's 2 pieces of yarn there instead of 1. So I want to make sure that when I make this stitch, I go through both of those yarns. I want to go through both of those. And then I'm going to just make a stitch as usual. And right now I'm doing knits and purls because I'm on that ribbing section. And if you haven't seen previous videos, always go between the needles when you change from front to back. And when you get done, there will be a very small, noticeable difference in those stitches that had the 2 yarns. So if you were looking closely, you would see that these 12 stitches are ever so slightly thicker than the ones around it. Generally, by the time this is washed once, when you work the whole piece and then you've washed it once, that will kind of sink in and not be noticeable very much. It'll just kind of blend right in. You would have to know it was there and be looking for it to find it. And that is the clasping method. The other method, which I think is far fiddlier, is, I don't have another one on here. You get partially into your row, or you can do it at the edge of the row. That is still a very valid option to do it at the edge. But if your edges are going to be seen, that may not be a valid option. That's only a valid option if you're going to be hiding this. So you're going to be picking it up later and putting something else on it, or it's part of a seam that you're going to be sewing on and you can hide that extra yarn. Otherwise, you want to hide it somewhere inside your stitches, and you normally wouldn't do it so close to another one. And in this method, so we've gotten to the end of our yarn, the end of this ball, the end of this section, or there was a knot, and you literally just leave it, just drop it, leave it, pretend it's not there, pick up your new one, and just start working with it. Don't pull too hard. Make sure you kind of hold that end down, and don't pull too hard because you will just pull your stitch right out, because that end is not tethered to anything. So you can keep working on this And I'm not going to go all the way to the end of the row because I want you to see what this looks like. So when you come back to those stitches, and this is the way I did my joins for years and years before I found the clasping. When you come back to it, you want to be careful not to pull too much because those ends aren't tethered to anything, and you want to work that in. And now you have a little hole there and these tails. And when you get done with your piece, you would tighten those up to close that hole, cross them going in 2 different directions to keep that hole closed, and then you would weave these in as usual, which will end up causing an ever so slightly thick raised area. But some people are not comfortable working the 2 yarns in the clasping method. Those are the 3 ways that you can work joins to start a new color, to start a new yarn, to get rid of a knot, because you do not ever want knots in your work. They will, at best, they will end up working their way to the surface and you'll see them. At worst, they will come loose, and then you'll have a big hole in the middle of your sweater to fix. So it's much better to go ahead and take the time to cut the yarn and start a new section with a join than it is to have to fix a hole in your sweater later. Trust me on this. Do not use the knot. Just go ahead and do it. It's for your own good in the long run to put in that tiny bit of effort to not have a very tragic episode later when you pull your sweater out. It's got a giant hole and you no longer have that yarn, so you can't even fix it in a hidden way. And that is no more knots. I'll see you next time. Bye.